Okay, so we've got these excerpts from Dostoevsky's The Raw Youth, and wow, there's some seriously interesting stuff in here. We're going to dive into some of the really big ideas that we see, particularly this whole thing about youth and idealism, that kind of like spirit of rebellion that goes along with being young. It's like a window into the mind of this young guy who's trying to figure out who he is and where he fits in.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're reading through these passages, you really get a sense that he's becoming self-aware. You know, like he's just starting to really examine his own experiences and put them down on paper. He's thinking back on this recent meeting with his father, Versilov, and we get this feeling right away that something's not quite right. There's this undercurrent of unease, almost like he's searching for meaning, trying to make sense of it all.
And right in the middle of all this is this thing he keeps calling his idea. It's more than just a thought, right? It's
Yeah.
like this core part of how he sees himself. And he's super protective of it. Like he doesn't want anyone messing with it.
Yeah, that's so important. This idea of his, it's almost like a prototype of his identity, you know?
Mhm.
It gives him some stability while everything else is changing so fast. And it really shows how we all try to create these stories in our heads to help us deal with the uncertainty of life. He even says he's not interested in working for the grand future of humanity if it means giving up his own personal vision.
Right. I mean, that really stood out to me. It's like this huge declaration of, I'm going to do my own thing. He's rejecting those big collective ideals for something that's uniquely his. And it's not just about him either. He thinks every man has his own idea. So he believes that each person has this whole inner world that's different from everyone else's.
Exactly. And we see that play out when he refuses to share his idea with that group. He would rather have 2 rubles and be left alone. It shows how much this inner world means to him. It's precious, almost fragile, like any outside influence could ruin it. Makes you wonder if maybe he's guarding it so fiercely because he's insecure. Maybe he's afraid of being judged or misunderstood.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's not just about being independent, is it? It could be a way to protect himself, too.
Yeah.
And the way he talks about this idea as a fortress, a refuge, that really makes it seem like he needs this safe space inside himself, somewhere to escape to when the world feels confusing or even hostile.
Definitely. It creates a sense of order when everything outside feels chaotic. But then there's also this hint of conflict inside him, too. He mentions this vicious will and says he wants to prove he can give it up, even if it's just an ideal.
Uh,
So is this idea just a source of strength for him, or is it a place where he's fighting his own internal battles?
it's almost like this idea becomes the lens he uses to look at everything. It shapes how he sees the world and even justifies the things he does. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Absolutely. He's so caught up in this idea that it creates this distance between him and what's actually happening around him. It's a filter that colors all his interactions. And sometimes it even feels like he's using it as an excuse for behavior that's hard to explain.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about his dad, Versilov. When they first connect, it feels very formal, almost distant. Versilov sends for him to come to Petersburg after getting a letter. And it's not even a letter that's addressed to him directly.
Yeah, and that right there tells us something about the relationship. There's no warmth, no closeness. And remember, the narrator has only seen Versilov once before when he was a little kid. So their connection is pretty weak. Even the letter itself, it promises a private situation, which sounds cold and businesslike, especially when you consider their father and son.
And the narrator's first impression of Versilov is rough. He calls him cold, proud, careless, and disdainful. That's a pretty harsh judgment for a son to make about his father, especially one he barely knows. It feels like there's this big emotional wall between them.
There definitely is. And this first impression probably influences everything that happens between them after this. The narrator's trying to figure out who his father is, what motivates him. But it starts from this place of distance and maybe even resentment.
And there's this little detail that really stood out to me. When someone refers to Versilov as the narrator's father, he winces, like it's a word that doesn't fit. It shows how uncomfortable he is with that label. There's this gap between them being biologically related and what their relationship actually feels like.
Exactly. It's a relationship that exists more on paper than in real life. And it's made even more complicated by the fact that the narrator knows his dad's having money problems and is generally unhappy. So you have this father figure who's weighed down by his own issues and maybe not able to give his son the guidance or connection that he's looking for.
Okay, so let's talk about this theme of youthful rebellion. Remember that story about the narrator and the former student on Tversky Boulevard? They're making fun of these respectable women. It seems like a classic example of young people rebelling.
Totally. It might seem like harmless mischief on the surface, but underneath, it's this urge to challenge social norms, to make fun of what they see as uptight and hypocritical about the way things are. They're testing the boundaries and asserting their freedom, even if it comes out in a kind of immature way. And later, the narrator links this back to his idea, which suggests that even these seemingly random actions were somehow connected to his personal philosophy.
And then there's his reaction to Kraft's suicide. He killed himself for the sake of an idea. This seems to have a big impact on the narrator, but maybe not in the way you'd expect.
Kraft's actions show how dangerous it can be to be completely devoted to an abstract ideal. Like to the point where it destroys you. But the interesting thing is how the narrator reacts. He's not focused on the sadness of the suicide itself. He's disgusted by the intrigues and the lying he sees in everyone else. It shows how idealistic he is, maybe even a little naive. He admires the purity of Kraft's commitment, even though it led to something terrible. But at the same time, he judges everyone else for being morally compromised.
There's also that short but important moment with the younger boy. The narrator insists he's grown up, even though the kid calls him a small boy. It's something we've all experienced, right? That desire to be taken seriously, to be seen as mature and independent, to not be treated like a child anymore.
Absolutely. It captures that tension that comes with being young. You want to be independent, but you still need people. It's another example of young people trying to define themselves and find their place in the world.
And these excerpts give us some really interesting insights into how the narrator sees himself. He admits to being stupid in reality, even though he imagines himself as smart. That's a pretty honest thing to say about yourself.
It is. It shows that beneath all this idealism and rebellion, he's actually pretty self-aware. This gap between how he sees himself and his actual experiences probably contributes to his feeling isolated, like he doesn't fit in. It makes sense that he would withdraw into his own thoughts and his idea.
Yeah, and he definitely prefers to be alone. He thinks other people are intellectually inferior. So it reinforces this idea that his idea is something special, something only he can really understand.
Right. This belief that he's smarter than everyone else, whether it's true or not, makes him feel even more disconnected from people. It's like he's isolating himself on purpose. He has trouble connecting with people who he doesn't see as insightful, so he relies even more on his own inner world.
And then we see him making these practical decisions. He wants to live frugally, to limit how much he spends on food. He refuses to become a pawnbroker or moneylender. It's like his idea is starting to affect his everyday life. He's rejecting certain values and roles that society pushes on him.
These decisions show that he wants a different kind of life, one that's not all about money. He doesn't want to do things that he sees as taking advantage of people or morally wrong. It suggests that he has this strong ethical framework, and it's probably tied to his idea.
And even though he's so invested in his idea, he knows it might not be completely original. But he still insists that it's important to him personally. It's like he's saying, yeah, maybe other people have thought about these things before, but they're new and important to me.
Right. He gets that it might not be groundbreaking, but he emphasizes the personal journey, the way this idea is changing how he sees the world and his place in it. It's less about being a brilliant intellectual and more about this individual process of finding meaning.
So to wrap things up, this deep dive into the raw youth shows us a young man who's really trying to figure himself out. We see this powerful mix of youthful idealism, these personal philosophies that give him comfort and justification, and this urge to question everything and push back against what society expects of him.
Exactly. What really comes through is how raw and contradictory these feelings are. He's dealing with complex emotions. He's trying to understand his relationship with his father, and he's trying to create his own identity based on this evolving idea that he has. It's messy and internal, and it feels so relatable to anyone who's ever been young.
And it really makes you think about how young people today are doing the same thing. How do they form their own beliefs and values, their own ideas, and how do they deal with the world that they're inheriting?
This excerpt shows us that the search for meaning and independence is something that's always been a part of being young. How do these fortresses of belief get built in today's world with so much information and so many different perspectives flying around? And how does that youthful spirit of rebellion show up in response to the challenges that young people face today? It's fascinating to see how this human need to understand ourselves keeps playing out over time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Deep Dive.
Of course. See you next time.